I'd also like to thank the jury, who is all represented here, for, of course, letting this project be the third Middlebrook Prize for Canadian Curators version. But more importantly, I'd like to say a word about how it all began, because of course I used this platform as a way to experiment with certain ideas that I had previously been engaged with as a curator. But even the title, as it would suggest, I think this word queer is sometimes misinterpreted and misunderstood in contemporary culture. So to have the jury's support in making this come to be is really important, because it proves that you know, we are building dialogue around certain themes that are not always spoken about in public like this, which I'm very grateful for. And you know, this is all to say that I'm really happy that each of these works might inspire some kind of thought or discussion that would go beyond the gallery today. So, of course, that is a welcome thank you as well. I'd like to keep the structure of the talk kind of informal. I set the dawn a few minutes ago. I always prefer when a curator or an artist, for example, speaks and there's more of a discussion that comes to be afterwards. So if you have questions or comments that come to mind, please keep them in thought, and I'm happy to engage with you, and we can even go beyond this space and talk more about them, so please feel welcome to do so. I thought it might be relevant in many ways to discuss what I've been doing as a curator for the greater part of 3 years, and as a writer as well. It's not easy to be a young person in Canada and trust your kind of creative instincts in this public forum, but I have to say that living in Ottawa for the greater part of 4 years, I had the support of a mentor and really a colleague in many respects, but more of a mentor. His name is Guy Berube. He can't be here today, but he's a gallerist and a director, as well as an art dealer in Ottawa, and he, I would say, really is the spark that makes me tick in terms of my own creative and curatorial work. So Guy and I have worked together for as long as I've been in Ottawa, really. It started with an internship, and it turned out to be that we became creative collaborators. And examples of projects we've done previously and more recently, in November, we were in Valparaiso in Chile, and we did a project called The Disciples, where we brought together 12 former political prisoners from the Pinochet regime, and we resituated in many ways large-scale portraits of these men in the former prison and torture facility which they were once held in, which is ironically in many ways now a fully functioning cultural center. So that's one example. Another is a related project called Windows from Prison. We did that in April this year. It was a project that was also initiated by the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, and that project revolved around an artist named Mark Strandquist, and he worked with individuals in maximum incarcerated facilities across the United States, and the resulting exhibition was really an exhibition based on the materials and writing materials that came from this interaction. So these are some examples of the way I tick creatively, I would say, and more so, they relate to what is going on in this space in less explicit ways, but in my own creative process. So just a note here, I see the Middlebrook exhibition as an extension of this, in the sense that there is a move taking place in my own thinking away from the spectacular or spectacular logic towards the indecisive, the unresolved, and contingent politics of everyday resistance that are so often hidden from view in our day-to-day lives. So on this point, to provide some context here, I know forgive me in advance, but I want to read a little bit just about the project so that we're all at least thinking in the same way about the way that these works speak together. So, which is, some of it's available in that wall text, but The Queer Feeling of Tomorrow explores themes of doubt, resilience, and agency through the work of 6 practicing local, national, and international artists. They are Sunil Gupta, John Hanning, Shan Kelly, Julia Martin, David Pullman, and Laura Woodcock. Each of these artists work to locate the complex, unspoken, and oftentimes inexplicable excesses of identity and community. And I think it's also important to briefly note here that in tandem with this exhibition, we're producing a workshop that will be taking place at the end of November, and it's titled Queer Futures, and it's run in part by Pearl Van Geest, who is here, right here today. There she is. And really the idea behind this workshop is to support the exhibition with dialogue and exchange with high school and neighboring university students. And the hope really is to have these people come together in one space, and we will build a catalog for the exhibition, both a material object, one that will be available online throughout, the duration of this exhibition, of course, but also afterwards. So the idea of a queer feeling of tomorrow, it suggests a playful uncertainty of our personal, political futures in a supposedly post-AIDS historical moment. Together, these works construct an amalgamation of obstructed documents, fragmented biographical notes, and half-emptied out forms held in a continuous flux of contextualization and recontextualization and decontextualization. So it's this ongoing process, I think, of exchange between the works and against them as well. The exhibition expresses a double play in this respect of optimism and skepticism, tracing a spirit of life affirmation that is at the same time a kind of restless doubt. And on the one hand, these works trace a kind of candid levity, and on the other, they embody a self-conscious facetiousness and also a harsh irony. So I'm sure many of you are thinking, based on the title, unlike it may suggest, though, the exhibition is not about queer art or sexual identity proper. Neither is it interested in documenting the changing face of LGBT acceptance in mainstream Western culture. Instead, this queerness that I'm trying to locate in the gallery space is really about a provisional retreat from ideas of willful or transparent political speech. So this sensibility that I think all of these artists embody thrives within an altogether inconsistent formal language that is really composed of unfinished sentences, circular word babble, abandoned signs, precarious historical revisions, and so on. Given the fact that today there is no shortage of exhibitions that focus on the relationship between, one could say, HIV/AIDS issues, late 20th century identity politics, and related forms of activist artistic practices, I think it's important to pose a question that has really motivated my thinking creatively throughout the course of these 3 years that I've been speaking about, which is to say, how do we situate or cultivate queer thinking in society, in the gallery, and otherwise, without submitting to problematic cultural essentialisms or the rhetoric of a post-everything identity politics. So to address the challenges that this intentionally difficult question raises, what I'm attempting to pursue, I guess, in this exhibition is a sense of positive differentiation that can't be reduced to the logic of queer representation as we might traditionally think about it. And therefore, the didacticism, I would argue, of a kind of rigid, objectivist historical narrative of seamlessly unfolding events in time. In other words, this means exploring a language of difference that is not simply interested in verifying the injurious effects of heterosexist or homophobic discourse in culture that might seek to present works of art and the lives of artists as they actually occur in society. So it's worth stating, I think, that in July, I produced an exhibition in Toronto at a small gallery. It was titled A Minimal Doubt. And many of the ideas in this space really reflect as an extension and continuation of those themes that I was dealing with. So that exhibition brought together 3 artists, all Canadian, Andrew MacPhail, Vincent Chevalier, and then Shan Kelly, who is also here in this space. What I really tried to get at with this exhibition was, it was 9 works in total, highlighting cross-sectional readings between HIV-positive status and aesthetic value, proposing a certain deferral of self-knowledge through queered forms of language and text. So the title, obviously, A Minimal Doubt, is intended to raise a problematic, which is to say that when we state that doubt is minimal, it evokes a kind of implicit hope, of course, like this is what we all think. But I'm interested in this term more so in the fact that this term also keeps the ideas of inaction and obsolescence and so forth at the center of the discussion. So I would say that this is really the essential kernel or the moment of decision that inspires this exhibition and the works that came of it. So I think it's important now, I'll turn to the artists themselves and kind of go through the space so we all have a little bit of context here. For the sake of brevity, though, I'll focus on some in more depth and then pass by others that might be more self-evident to the viewer. So beginning, you can turn to see David Poolman. He has two works here. The first is titled Protest Cancelled Due to Rain, which is the sculptural object in the plinth, and then the second is Average Grief, which is the black flag. And really, my thinking behind these two works came to be through a kind of thinking where the sign and the flag are probably the two most iconic forms of political will that we know today. And to see the way that David has kind of half emptied out both of these objects with a kind of precarious indecision really, for me, becomes a perfect welcoming gesture to the other works that follow in this exhibition. And of course, the striking element of the signs here is that they're shrunken down and piled up so that they really have a sense of loss of identity, but also they become new objects in the world, and we're allowed to reflect on what this pile means and why is it a pile and not one. So these are some of the thoughts I have with David's work. But the second is Sunil Gupta, who was just behind the bar here. Three works from his series Sun City, which is created in 2010. It was commissioned by the Pompidou Museum in Paris, and it was originally exhibited as 16 large-scale photographs. These are on loan from Stephen Bulger in Toronto, his gallery representation here. But really the idea behind these works is that they closely reflect in narrative form Chris Marker's 1962 very iconic film, actually, La Jetée, which many of you, if you're students, would be familiar with that title. And really, what makes these photographs interesting is that there is a clearly absent film at stake here. There is something absent. And even though that we've reduced them to three, I think this is actually more present in this space than it would be otherwise. The elliptical form of the original narrative is retained so that the protagonist unknowingly sees his own death in the beginning, but it also becomes the last frame of this lost film. Gupta writes in his own words here, and I'll read them to you, quote, "The nuclear apocalypse found in Marker's film," I'll get this right, "has been replaced with the ongoing HIV/AIDS crisis. Furthermore, the heterosexual possibility of romantic love, which drives the original character, has been replaced with an immigrant homosexual one." So Sunil's works are important for me in this space because not only is he an artist I look up to with a great deal of respect in my own studies, but I think that these works really initiate these themes in a beautiful, however paradoxically this sounds, in a beautifully fragmented way in this space. The next is John Hanning. His three works here, it's okay. I Survived AIDS, which is originally created in 2013, but he issued a kind of special edition series for this show, in around this show. These three objects, obviously it's a striking subject matter, but they are authentic middle school portraits of the artist as a young child, repositioned and acting as a background for, I would say, a future violence and stigma that he could not and did not know at that point, of course. And I'll skip Shan's work for a second, I'll come back to it afterwards, but the next work to point attention to is Julia Martin's Uneasy, from the series You Are Talking to Yourself, which is an altered image inkjet print. Each of these works in the series, but this one, I think it's striking with respect to the other works in the exhibition, is comprised of a different broken off adage or an axiom or even explication that is repurposed on a found digitally accessible public domain image. So that's Julia's work. The other works in the series are fantastic. If you have a chance to check out her website, I would really encourage you to do so. Laurel Woodcock is the neon work in the last wall here. The title is untitled, but it does have an extended one, which is a film by John Baxter, 1946, a song by the Beatles, 1969, an album by Nina Simone, which is 1971, and a novel by Tom Holt, which is 1993. The work was originally created in 2011, but I'm really happy to see it here in this space. I think it adds a certain almost interruption of the bodily, phenomenological encounter of the artwork in this space. And of course, what's striking here is that we're forced to look down on a phrase that is so, I don't even know how to phrase it, but precariously familiar and also so distant. I mean, we all know this phrase, but to see it in a different context, especially with these surrounding works, I think adds a new dimension on this idea of agency, really. So with John's work, with Sunil's work, with Julia's work, and also, of course, with Laurel's, I think the idea of appropriation and quotation is something to really stress here when we're talking about themes of self-knowledge and what this means in contemporary culture. So lastly, I'd like to draw focus to Shan Kelly's two installations, who is a really phenomenal young artist, and he's someone I really am glad to be able to support in this context. The mixed media installation before us here is Mostly Blanks, which is 2012. And a note on the materiality here, Nothing to Worry About is painted in an industrial powder coat spelled out in standard military lettering along a group of 22 authentic military canisters. And you'll note that the markings on the side here, when you get a chance, some of them are bearing the text of blank and some of them bear the text of small arms. And when we position this in the context of Shan's interest in critically exploring his own HIV undetectable status, the intersection of this medical, militaristic, and colloquial discourse, I think, is really important to stress here. But finally, the work which is, it seems like it's in the middle, and that's how I view it, but this is a work called Of Hope and Sickness. And it's a diptych. The two images are, of course, taken at two very different times in the artist's life, made in 2013. And I do think that it really encapsulates the idea of this show, so I wanted to read some of Shan's own words to share with doing respect to the subject matter about this piece. So, quote, "In the moment this photograph was taken, my mother had managed to see past the difficult and mysterious illness which plagued me and decided to capture the humor in my present vulnerable state without pity or victimization. After such a brutal and lengthy sickness brought me to lie here amidst the sanctity of my mother's comfort, I tested HIV positive several days later. After diagnosis, I would return again to the sanctity of that couch in my parents' home and regress into that very infantile state which was once just foreshadowed. Here, 4 years later, watching my daughter's sleep-triggered contemplation on the innocence of the present moment, and contemplation on a passage in life that I never thought I would live to see. Reflection now on this dichotomy is the preservation of a moment which serves to frame my entire relationship with my own mortality, perseverance, and hope, with an asterisk." And that last part is extremely important to consider here. So I think, considering all these different artworks and the amazing diversity here, it's in the most elementary sense, I think it becomes clear that each of these artists illustrate possible futures that on the one hand are taken as forms of optimism, and on the other are expressions of real doubt. And really, this becomes the choice of the spectator. This is my real thinking behind this exhibition, is we all have to make a choice how to view these works and what we take from it, if we step into optimism, if we fall into grief, what this negotiation feels like in the moment. So taken to the extreme then, this slippery double talk that is staked between yesterday and tomorrow, it kind of frames an absurdist and productively absurdist space in my view. And within this framework, I'd like to really end here in this brief talk, and hopefully we can open it up afterwards, but by stating that each work both pursues and cultivates the integrity of the unspectacular for its own sake. And what this really does is it a lot of the conventional and romantic notions that we might attach to what it means to have a personal or political transformation. And in my estimation, it really is this negotiation, this very careful negotiation between optimism and doubt that really emerges to us as queer. And so that is really what I find most interesting about that word in this space.